Okay, so I'm going to do a lecture on Deleuze and Guattari's idea of the despotic signifier, which I think actually gives a way into their philosophy quite well, because Deleuze and Guattari want to have a philosophy of maximum contingency. If you've heard terms like the body without organs, or machines, or desiring production, all of these are ways of talking about difference, because there is a totalizing tendency, especially in continental philosophy. We can see it, starting with Heraclitus and Parmenides, trying to talk about the one versus the many, and with talks of essences of things, we have a bit of an issue which Deleuze and Guattari will just call representational thinking, or representationalism generally. The problem with representationalism is when we look at what makes a thing, what is its essence, its isness, we can look at things in a representational or non-representational way. In a representational way, we look at a thing and we say it is a representation of a more perfect thing. This perfect thing for Plato are the forms. They exist in a different kind of metaphysical dimension almost. So for any property, say an oak tree, there is a perfect oak tree, and all particular oak trees are derivatives of that form, and they represent that form. Now, the problem that Deleuze and Guattari see with this is it's going to lead to naturally seeing difference as a lack, where you'll have oak trees with different leaf densities and trunk diameters and breadth of their root structure and all this different stuff. And if we view them as if there is a more perfect version, and there's kind of a gradation downwards into less and less close representations of that perfect form, we start to see difference with this added connotation of some differences being better than others. And Deleuze and Guattari think that this idea of lack is a big problem, and it results from despotic signification, which really is equivalent to representational thinking. A despot, of course, is someone who has this power and uses this power to disparage all kinds of people. This could be a feudal lord, this could be a capitalist, this could be the father in an abusive family, this could be any number of things. And of course, if we're trying to pick apart this word, we have despot and then we have signifier. And this, of course, is part and parcel of the language of semiotics, or semiology is the word that Deleuze and Guattari use, although semiotics is probably more what we're used to today. And in semiotics, we have signs. And what signs do is, just like in real life, they point to something. And what they point to is meaning, value, objectivity, real identity, reality. If we imagine, there are all kinds of properties that are floating about. Even in a room, you have lots of different brightnesses and intensities of light. You have different intensities of pressure and thus of sound. You have intensities of various densities of objects, and Deleuze and Guattari want to focus on this idea of intensities, because really there is a question in philosophy that I definitely see as being embodied in Hegel, which is, how does the subject come about? How do we become what we are, and how do we become conscious and aware of the world? And how do we differentiate ourselves from other things such that we become our own unique thing, our own unique subject, capable of having experiences and whatnot? So Deleuze and Guattari want to talk about intensities because they want to try to take account of everything, and they want to get the fullest context for how exactly things are coming about. And say we have in a room a desk. This desk is just a table, and it has on it a glass of water with water in it. We see these as two distinct entities. But of course, they are, in this case, attached to each other in a sense. They are taking up space together, and the question is, why do we think of them as different things? Now, Deleuze and Guattari want to do this without referencing some perfect form, some signifier, that being the form, which signifies, it has the act of yielding the signified, namely the identity of the thing. So in terms of the table and the glass of water, we could think of, I don't know, maybe we have some ideal image of a table and some ideal image of a glass in our heads, and we use this as grounds to say that the objects are different things, that they each have their own form of representation. Now, the only problem that Deleuze and Guattari see with this is that certain signifiers are worse than others. And when we think about there being a more perfect form of something, we can see that all the particulars that refer to that form, so all the different tables and all the different glasses of water, start to become hierarchicized or hierarchicalized, like we talked about before, into greater or lesser forms. And it starts to become difficult to imagine real newness if something merely differing from this representation is just not as perfect. So, for example, say we took our desk or our table and we molded the flat surface such that it's wavy now. So it still has the legs of the table or the desk, and it's still made of the same material, but the top is wavy. And we could say this is a more deficient form of, or more deficient representation of the higher form. Now, Deleuze and Guattari's problem is that here, this table being merely different has now become a form of lack, deficiency. And they see this as counterproductive, literally counterproductive, in the sense that it takes a genuine productive moment that is producing a new form of table and treats it as if it is in fact the opposite of production, as if we are losing something. But for Deleuze and Guattari, everything is productive. Even if it has reference to some signifier, such as a table, every new table is a productive moment, and it's different in its own ways, and it's tempting to be like Hegel and say, okay, we have all these particulars, but they are united and can be dialectically sublated to be referencing both a particular table at any one point, so say the table we have in our room, but also references the universal, the ideal form. And thus we think that we are able to talk about tables, because whenever I can refer to a specific table, I can refer to it as a particular table and also as a member of the form of tables, that this is a representation of a table. But the problem with that is that all variation and difference becomes subsumed under what Deleuze and Guattari would call despotic signification, which is going to turn production into counterproduction. It's going to turn newness into lack. And this is Deleuze and Guattari's ground for criticizing the Oedipus complex, God, Lacan's idea of the Phallus, and capitalism. And they're going to do this throughout Anti-Oedipus, and they will continue to do it in 1000 Plateaus, but Anti-Oedipus is really focused centrally on this idea of despotic signification. They want to do away with this idea that when we talk about things, we must necessarily be talking about them in reference to some perfect, universal, abstract form. For Deleuze and Guattari, they're critical of the signifier signified language in general because it's a bit slippery, but they are especially critical of signifiers, of these forms that stand outside of desiring production. Which is to say, they are critical of these ideas of forms that stand outside of material processes. And this is not to say they are strict materialists. They, of course, and I think this is why their ontology is so interesting, they are able to take account of emergence, of how certain material things are able to have things that they are good for. For example, a knife can be good for cutting. It can also be good for threatening somebody, or it can be good for putting on display. And these may have various linkages to their material properties. But we could also imagine many other uses that are more contingent than that, and also more new than we could think. Various different uses for knives, which need not be linked to how sharp it is. But Deleuze and Guattari are strictly worried about the real. They make this very clear throughout, and this might sound very strange coming from, for example, someone like Baudrillard, who wants to problematize the idea of the real. But what Deleuze and Guattari mean by the real is everything that is productive is real. So, dreams, for example, are productive. They being Deleuze and Guattari, through one of their many times that they foment a critique of Freud and the Oedipus complex, is they say that, for example, his interpretation of dreams presupposes Oedipus as a despotic signifier, as a form of interpretation for unconscious and preconscious desire that stands outside of productive things, productive flows. And Oedipus is used as our matrix for how we go about interpreting dreams. And when we do that, we discover that certain very varying dreams, I mean, one could be dreaming about a wolf, or one could be dreaming about riding their bike, or one could be dreaming about skydiving, or one could be dreaming about a train going into a tunnel. Now, Deleuze and Guattari, and dreams is a great example of their sort of productive ontology they're trying to go for. Deleuze and Guattari want to say that every single dream is a unique, productive experience. And of course, it is linked to our desires that we have, the things that are in our brains, and which are in our brains in relation to all the material processes going on around us, all the atomistic interactions that are making our brain chemistry as such. You know, this is all influencing our desires. And Freud, in part, is trying to figure out what are our unconscious desires that are being covered up partly by society to make us cooperate with one another, but also by ourselves for things that we don't want to admit to ourselves that cause all sorts of neuroses and things like that. Deleuze and Guattari want to say that every single dream is a unique, productive experience. And the problem with Freud is he approaches a dream and he says, no, that train is actually a penis. and the tunnel of vagina. And this is secretly expressing your desire, you, assuming you're a young boy in this case, as Freud often does. And this is expressing your secret desire to have sex with your mother. And this proves the Oedipus complex correct. Deleuze and Guattari are extremely critical of this, and I want to go into more detail about their critiques of Oedipus in another video, but I think it's important just to get a sense of what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get at here, is that Oedipus is a despotic signifier. It is placed as an interpretive schema for human unconscious desires, but it's not exactly clear why it ought to be that way. Deleuze and Guattari, the way that they write about this makes it so clear that Freud chooses a signifier which, by standing apart from productive flows, it doesn't matter what you dream. Freud is always going to say that it's Oedipus. It always has been Oedipus, and it's your job as the patient to sit there and, with the help of the psychoanalyst, realize, oh yes, it was always Oedipus. Oh, of course, this is what it was trying to tell me, right? You want the psychoanalyst to interpret your dreams and tell you what you actually desire, what you didn't know you wanted, but they told you what you wanted. Deleuze and Guattari want to say, no, this is not a productive thing. In fact, this is turning production into counterproduction, into anti-production. Instead, why can't the train be a train? Or why can't the train be a gun? Or representative of a government? Or any number of things. Not only is the train a train, but it could also be representative of any number of things. And their critique of utilizing Oedipus here and invoking Oedipus is that it is naturally going to be insistent beyond need. It is going to produce a sort of despotism where it always will appear justified, even when it's being denied. I mean, Freud will say this in the interpretation of dreams, that when people came back and said that, oh, my dream said that you were wrong, Freud's like, exactly, that's what your unconscious wants to tell you. You want your analyst to be wrong, or you wanted to be right, so you told yourself that your analyst was wrong or whatever, but in fact that proves that I was right, that you're against me or whatever. So Freud is always going to make his theories unfalsifiable like this, and this is really their problem, Deleuze and Guattari's, with despotic signification, is it creates a sense of unfalsifiability where we have some form outside of production dictating how we ought to interpret things, what things ought to mean. And Deleuze and Guattari say this is inherently going to lead to a truncation of newness. Deleuze and Guattari say, and they kind of connect this to ideas of revolution, of socialist or capitalist or communist ideas of revolution, and how does genuine newness come about in the political order. And they say, look, if we use something like the party as a signifier for what true revolution is, like very Maoist, like If it's in line with the party, then it's revolutionary tendencies, and if it's not, it's revisionist history or whatever, whatever it may be. They see this as yet another moment of despotic signification, of taking revolution and making it into some way that it ought to be, that stands outside of the actual historical material situation of what's going on. And I think with their idea of revolution, we can see how Deleuze and Guattari are trying to step out of representationalism. They say that revolution does not represent any particular form of the most perfect revolution. In fact, revolution is a moment-by-moment contingency, and we have to try to use schizoanalysis as a way to get outside of representation and instead view desiring production, which is Deleuze and Guattari's word to basically talk about the productive capacities of humans. Instead of viewing things as a lack, they want to get back to the idea that, for example, dreams is constant desiring production, that human labor capacity is even desiring production, that it is always desire that is producing these new flows and singularities and tendencies, and all of these words encapsulate what they're trying to look at. Instead of looking at these forms of representation that stand apart from material conditions, they instead want to insist on the real incessantly, where we're not trying to get back to the way things are, so to speak, but we're insisting that they already are, in the sense that we're doing what Heidegger says, zu den Sachen selbst, to the things themselves. It's a very phenomenologist thing, but in a sense it's also doing away with phenomenology, because really what we're trying to do is look at reality as a constant continuum of difference, and differences that establish connections with other differences, or flows, because flows is basically Deleuze and Guattari's word for difference. And we want to see how these flows are going to interact with each other contingently. And the interactions they make are going to form tendencies and minimums of density that are going to cause singularities to occur. These congregations together of various points that are going to establish temporary identities. And here we can see Deleuze and Guattari's idea of subject formation and really entity formation, that everything is maximally contingent, in that what it is not some essence that it should be, but rather is what it is, insofar as it is a machine. And the purpose of using the word machines, and this is crucial for understanding Anti-Oedipus, is that it is productive. It uses energy, desire, flows, and it produces. And what it produces is real. So that is a basic idea for Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's ontology, and their idea of despotic signification, which, if you want to get into Anti-Oedipus, is probably the most important term you need to learn. A lot of people like to start with the body without organs, which I did in my previous lecture on Deleuze and Guattari. Or they like to go to machines, or they like to go to Oedipus. But in a sense, it's a lot larger than that. Deleuze and Guattari are trying to get outside of looking at things as having an essence. Instead of having an essence that they can be deficient in, they are merely in a constant state of becoming, a productive capacity where they are constantly undergoing new formations and creating new contingencies. And this opens up the possibility for newness via lines of flight. These are almost breaks that form in subject formation in this complex of flows that allows for newness to come precisely because each of these moments is completely unique and new. And when we understand a field like this, a field of productive flows that are maximally contingent, we can see that really everything is new in a sense. But of course we can say in another sense that it is not, and they will say that capitalism, for example, is going to tend to this sort of, this sort of nausea, in a sense, kind of the reign of the model, or Baudrillard says something like that, the terror of the model. And of course that is going to create a whole new problematic that is going to open up. But I hope that these topics give you some clarity on some of Deleuze and Guattari's ideas, and that you can plunge into Anti-Oedipus, hopefully with some more confidence. I'll definitely be doing some more deep dives into particular sections of the work, because there's so much fruit to bear from this work. It's a very new idea, and it has some interesting things to say about potential political goals and the shifting of these political goals, as well as, of course, points of ontology and criticisms of Lacan and Freud and others. So I hope this has been helpful, and I will see you in another lecture.